I want to introduce Janis Searles-Jones, who's the Chief Executive of the Ocean Conservancy. Janis, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Moving from a kind of water that we drink to a kind of water that we cannot drink, how are you feeling about the oceans today?
Let me say one thing following Radhika and Miguel. It is really, I'm very grateful to the Atlantic for actually connecting both parts of the water cycle, because the ocean is a hugely important part of the water cycle. 97% of the planet's water is actually held in the ocean. So when we think about access to clean water for communities, when we think about a healthy ocean and everything that we need and rely on the ocean for, making that connection between fresh water and salty water is really important. So I'm very grateful to the Atlantic for doing that for this panel. And I would say it is all connected. We need systems to protect the entire water cycle for all of us, and the ocean in particular is in trouble, in particular right now because of the same kinds of pollution concerns we've been talking about earlier and because of climate change. And so putting some attention on the ocean right now will reverberate with some of the clean water discussions we've been having as well.
I want to ask you what may seem a very preliminary question, but I think is important to establish as a baseline. In what directions are the oceans moving right now? Are you feeling more optimistic about them? Are you feeling more pessimistic about them? Where do we stand on ocean health today, and where are we going?
I'm going to say it's a little bit of both. So the ocean has been an incredible buffer for all of us when it comes to climate change. And so the ocean really is what makes life on the planet possible. It's what makes terrestrial land habitable. The ocean's absorbed about 30% of emissions, and it's also absorbed about 90% of the heat. So it's really protected us a great deal from emissions thus far, but that buffering role and that buffering impact has had a real cost on the ocean. So you have this background impact of warming ocean temperatures, of increasing ocean acidity, and those things are quite concerning, and that is compounded by the more direct human impacts on the ocean, overfishing, pollution, habitat destruction, and things like that. So from how is the ocean doing standpoint, there's some very, very, very concerning things that have implications for all of us and how we are all going to manage in this changed world that we all live in now. But at the same time, I do have a lot of optimism because there are so many more people who are making connections to the ocean, who are interested in ocean conservation, who are rising to the climate challenge and including oceans in climate action, and so many more young people in particular coming into thinking about the ocean and ocean conservation, that I think that there are very real opportunities going forward. So while the background is not great, the future could be if we actually harness all that energy and really point things in the right direction.
Speaking about the background, what has the Trump administration done or not done on oceans? Have they made any policy? Have they reversed policies that you think were important?
So the Trump administration has put almost the entire outer continental shelf potentially up for leasing for oil and gas development in a moment in time where it really doesn't make sense to double down on fossil fuel investments and create additional fossil fuel infrastructure. The Trump administration just recently announced a rule to roll back decades of interpretation of the National Environmental Policy Act, which is a very sane statute that Congress passed in the same era as the Clean Water Act passage that basically says if you're a federal agency and you're taking a federal action that might significantly affect the quality of the human environment, you actually have to think about the impacts of that action. You have to disclose them to the public. You have to consider public comments. And then you need to choose, you don't have to choose the best option. You can still choose an environmentally damaging option, but you still have to allow the public to contribute to that decision, and you have to lay bare what those trade-offs and considerations are. So it's a look before you leap statute, and it's incredibly important, particularly in the ocean space, because the ocean is overwhelmingly federal. Most of what happens in the ocean is regulated by federal entities. And so asking those federal agencies to actually think about the impacts of their ocean of their actions and then ask the public what they think is hugely important. And this administration is pulling that back and potentially really reducing the consideration of cumulative impacts of climate change, of other things that are incredibly important for the ocean right now.
Whenever we talk
examples, there are lots more.
Whenever we talk about federal ocean policy or federal climate policy, really, there's always this question: well, are states doing things? As you just mentioned, the oceans are overwhelmingly federal, and not even every state has a coastline. So, are there state policies that you think are moving in the right direction? Are there state policies that have made the situation worse?
States have been a real bright spot, actually, when you're asking about the optimism, pessimism continuum.
Is that on climate or just on oceans?
On climate and oceans. And
yeah.
One of the things I will say is ocean and climate are really inextricably linked now. You really can't solve one without the other. And so not considering ocean when you're thinking about climate mitigation, when you're thinking about climate adaptation, you're really missing an important piece of the puzzle. And so I'll use the West Coast states as an example. They have done a lot of thinking about ocean acidification. As an example, ocean acidification is caused when carbon dioxide dissolves in seawater, and it ultimately makes the seawater a little bit more acidic, which makes it difficult for ocean creatures that basically use calcium to form shells to actually do that. And so it has huge impacts for commercial fisheries, for the food web, and so on and so on. And the West Coast states have really banded together and are thinking carefully about what they can do within their own jurisdictions to actually reduce the impact of ocean acidification in their local waters. They are thinking more comprehensively about climate and different things that they can do to reduce their local emissions. And so the states on both coasts really have served as real bright spots in this moment of time where a lot of climate regulation is being pulled back. They're real viable models that those states have banded together and put together that really serve as examples that hopefully will be able to transition to federal policy at some point in the future.
On oceans acidification, I think that gets at something that people might not understand, or is that always clear? I mean, that seems a very clear place where the health of oceans is connected to climate change. Are there others that we should be thinking about?
So in addition to ocean acidification, ocean warming has huge implications for the health of the ocean. You see fish stocks moving, so they're migrating to find temperatures that are more suitable for what their biology evolved to. But when that happens, you don't have always a match between prey and predator, so you may not have the food sources that you need. You see corals in particular having significant trouble with ocean temperatures and with ocean acidification. Corals are incredibly important habitat structures in the ocean. They have about 25% of the biodiversity in the ocean, even though they're a real small percentage of the ocean floor. And for communities that are based around corals, they have storm surge protection, they provide food, they provide jobs, they provide livelihoods, they provide recreation. And so they're incredibly important parts of ocean ecosystems and of human communities. And with warming, they expel the symbiotic algae that they need to survive. And so you see—
They fall apart, basically.
Yeah, you see an erosion and you see the coral skeletons instead of those vibrant coral communities. So those are sort of
I think when people hear corals, two examples. When people hear corals, I don't know, I think of the Great Barrier Reef. Are there coral communities like that in the United States?
Absolutely. So Florida is a great example where you have the Florida Coral Reef Tract, which is one of the most remarkable places in the United States in terms of having corals. So the Great Barrier Reef is extraordinary by any dimension, but there are a lot of important coral reefs that are smaller, but equally important to communities and equally important to that marine biodiversity in the United States as well. And there are incredible cold water coral communities too, up in Alaska, and in deeper waters that are really important habitat for fish, and they support commercial fisheries as well. So even the ones that you can't snorkel above in warm water or dive in warm water, deep sea corals are also really remarkable areas of biodiversity.
One last science question, and then we can go back to policy. Does sea level rise affect ocean health? Because I think when we think of sea level rise, which is another ocean impact we were just saying, when people think about sea level rise, it seems to affect people more. I don't know. We imagine submerged hotels and condos in Miami Beach. But does that affect the health of the animals and plants and creatures that live in the ocean?
One way to think about it is the ocean, blue carbon is one way to address climate change. The ocean is not just a victim of climate change, it's also a powerful source for solutions, and blue carbon, natural solutions, is one of those. And seagrasses, mangroves, salt marshes are really important sources of habitat, carbon sequestration, and they help stabilize shoreline communities. And as sea level rise increases, you're having some of those shallow waters flooded. And so you're losing these really important habitat components that help buffer seawater, that help buffer ocean acidification, that provide a habitat. So you're basically, if you think about the ocean as a series of habitats, you are migrating the ocean and all those ocean communities out of their habitats onto areas that are not permeable anymore, and things like that. And then the other piece of that to think about is as sea level rise increases, you may be moving into areas where you have more pollution going into the ocean. If you look at some of the predictions, for example, in the Gulf of Mexico, and look at the amount of oil and gas infrastructure that is likely to be submerged when we get out in the out years of sea level rise, you're putting a ton of hydrocarbon production underwater, and that will have pollution implications for the ocean as well.
What is the biggest, is there a pollutant that you're more worried about now than any other? And I'm going to say you can't say carbon is the answer.
Okay, dang it. I'm actually going to give you a class of pollutants, which is contaminants of emerging concern. There are some that we definitely know are particular problems. There are
these plastics? Are they from a certain kind of industrial process?
Oh, so I'm glad you mentioned plastics, because then that makes my answer even easier. Because in my head, plastics are carbon, and plastics are like a slow motion oil spill. So if I can put carbon back on the table, from carbon dioxide to
you can put carbon, plastic, okay.
Yeah, plastics would be top of the list right now. About 8 metric tons of plastics go into the ocean every year, and scientists estimate that by 2050, there'll be as much plastic as there will be fish in the ocean. And plastics exist in the ocean, and they just mechanically get smaller and smaller and smaller. And so you're seeing plastics at every level of the water column and all the way down into the sediments. And everybody's probably read about how plastics are already in our salt, in our beer, in our water, in our fish. Plastics are definitely top of the list after carbon dioxide.
And they get smaller and smaller, but they don't go away, right? So you can have these extremely small microplastics that remain chemically plastic.
That's right. And we don't really, it's really ironic in sort of the progress that we have made as a society. We've ended up using this incredibly durable material for an incredibly ephemeral use. And so we're living with the legacy of that production and those choices for a very long period of time.
I want to go to a question from a viewer. Anthony Santiago asks, what local or municipal level policy levers do you see as standouts or examples that more cities or states should follow?
So one example I'll use is the use and application of pesticides. Adding to my sort of slow motion oil spill analogy for plastics flowing into the ocean, I'll use Florida as an example. You've seen a real proliferation of harmful algal blooms, and you sort of have this this overlap between climate change, which is creating warmer temperatures, and then fertilizers running off into the ocean. And it's doing in the ocean what it does on land, right? You have this burst of productivity, you have fertilizes the ocean, a lot more plant life, which then dies, sinks down to the bottom of the ocean. And then as bacteria consume that, you suck all the oxygen out of the ocean, you get these huge dead zones. So there's a lot of work being done in some communities. Miami, I will use as an example, where they're looking at different ways and all of the levers that they have to actually educate individuals, but also work with larger companies and properties and things like that about how you actually apply all of those things on your land to avoid them ending up in the ocean and having those harmful algal blooms, which can affect fish, humans, dogs. I think everybody's seen from all of the Florida examples a couple of years ago, it can have a huge impact on quality of beach life and also marine life being able to survive in those zones. So that's
and
one
that's
example.
also, the fertilizers are, in contrary to climate change, a local issue too. So that can be mitigated. I mean, rivers are very long, but that can be mitigated at more of a local level than some of the climate issues we're talking about.
Yeah, and I think the challenge for local entities is to recognize the background climate change still needs advocacy. And so there are things you can do around climate change in your communities, but then the next lever is to try to create as much, we were talking about resilient communities before, and think about resilient communities for the ocean to create as much resilience in the system as you can so that it can still function as the climate change impacts are happening. And so that is looking at other sources of pollution and really trying to reduce as much of the insult that's happening on top of the climate change injury, if you will.
What, in your view, can individuals living in those communities do about water pollution or about climate change?
So I'll say two things. There's an interesting debate, I'll say, on Twitter and in other places about the relative importance of individual action and whether or not that adds up to anything. And so what I always tell people is wear the ocean on your sleeve. If you're someone who cares about the ocean, and if you like to breathe, you should care about the ocean because every second breath we take comes from ocean plants. And so the ocean is important to everybody. Wear the ocean on your sleeve and make sure that you advocate in your community about the ocean and why it is important to you. It's always really important for elected officials to hear about the concerns of their constituents. Even if they are with you, they still need to hear from you. So that's one thing. The second thing is that individual actions do matter and they add up in a cumulative way. Collective action can help shift things, and that's really important too. But then for me, the most important thing is to aim up and advocate up because there are the changes that we need to make, whether it's for provision of clean water to communities that don't have access to it, whether it's for reducing pollution into the ocean. Those are larger systems, and so it's really important for all of that individual impact to aggregate up and to push for policy changes, investment changes, system changes, up into your municipal and your state and your federal communities.
What does the mountaintop on oceans look like to you? What does the place where, what should we be aiming for, thinking about in ocean policy? Is it a big new federal law? Is it a way of looking at the oceans? What's the goal?
So a couple of things. One is that the ocean has been, to take the pollution analogy, and we've been talking about pipes and clean water, the ocean is the end of the pipe. It's ended up sort of being the ultimate externality for all of our pollution, whether it's carbon pollution, whether it's plastic pollution, whether it's pesticides and fertilizers, it all runs into the ocean at some point. And so part of it is having a completely different mental shift about externalities and who bears the cost of pollution.
Externalities as in externalities to markets. Externalities to the kind of things that we think about costing money.
Thank you. And as Veronica and Miguel were saying, communities of color disproportionately bear those costs across a lot of different dimensions, and particularly the pollution dimension. So part of it is just thinking about who should bear those costs and what role we all have in making sure that those costs aren't borne disproportionately, and how to figure out how to price those costs into markets so that markets can actually support all of that. So that's one thing. The second is that because the ocean, what did Mark say? Mark said something about sort of like out of sight, out of mind when it comes to when we actually figure out how to intervene. In some ways, the ocean is the ultimate out of sight, out of mind. As long as the waves work, most people think the ocean is just fine. And so we need to fundamentally rethink all of those ocean systems, recognize how much we need them, and then actually apply some protection into the ocean. So there's a large global movement right now to protect 30% of the ocean by 2030. And I'm sure Sylvia will talk about that later. And it's an incredibly important piece of the puzzle to make sure that we're building some resilience into ocean systems and some refugia where places have more sustainability than just sort of the open ocean, because the ocean is sort of treated as the ultimate commons.
Yeah.
And it has borne a lot of human activity for a very long time without having compensatory protected areas or compensatory protections.
One last question to be answered in a number. You said we were trying to preserve 30% of the oceans. What percent of the oceans are preserved right now?
It depends on whether you're talking about fully protected or protected in any means. It's less than 5%, and less than 3% is fully protected.